The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinician's Corner, a practice-building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential-focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Raina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative-focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Raina Lombardi.
Hello, welcome, Creative Podcast listeners. I'm excited to bring my next guest to the show. Her name is Juliet King, and she is an art therapist and mental health counselor, and big congratulations to her. She just finished her PhD, which is so exciting. We are joining the stream a little late today because I've been having some major technical difficulties. For whatever reason, StreamYard was not wanting to distribute to either the Facebook page or the YouTube page. So we're just doing Facebook, and I'm going to try and see how to get it on the YouTube later. But without further ado, welcome, Juliet. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So would you mind filling in listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, kind of your scope and your area of expertise that you've been developing over the course of your career?
Yeah. So I think the best way to kind of sum up my scope and probably overall purpose in life, at least until this point, is to explore and understand what I call the systematic integration of neuroscience and art therapy. And in my research, that has expanded into the understanding of how neuroscience, evidence and principles supports the work of all creative arts therapies and arts-based interventions. And so really looking at how do we take the science and use that to inform our theory, our practice, and then certainly our research methods so that we can continue building evidence for the value and importance of why arts-based interventions are so incredibly meaningful and powerful for people. So
I love that. And so what kind of pulled you in that area? Like what drew you into the brain and neuroscience? Because I feel like there's some of us that are really intrigued by that. And then others are like, that feels overwhelming.
It is overwhelming. There's so much to learn, It's so interesting and there's so much to learn. I've been an art therapist for half my life now, a little over half my life. And I've worked for, all these years in so many different clinical contexts with different people, different populations, different settings, from private practice, prison system, inpatient psychiatry, outpatient, behavioral health. I'm one of those people that always had a full-time job, but I always had a couple of side hustles, to use the language of the podcast. And that has really helped me, understand the different ways that art therapy works and the different approaches that we use in different contexts. Because of course, our work is very subjective, right? Mm-hmm. We're not interested in trying to manualize or cookbook our approaches just based on the very nature of what art therapy is, right? Rooted in this creative expression, which we don't want to put limits on that, right? And that can manifest itself in so many different ways. what I realized back in grad school is that we really didn't have any science-focused coursework. You know, I went to Kahneman University, which is now Drexel, and I had the privilege distinctly of being a part of a program that was visual art therapy, music therapy, and dance movement. And so in the creative arts therapy department, we had shared core coursework, which I always like really enjoyed. I'm a theory gal at heart, you know, so I love psychological theories, and I just love understanding, you know, mental health, mental disease, like what are the distinctions and continuum of such. And I noticed that the DMTs, the movement therapists, they got to take kinesiology and they took science-based courses. And I thought, well, why don't we? You know, but I didn't really think too much about it. I just thought, oh, that seems like it would be fun. And, you know, as soon as I graduated, I worked in community behavioral health for a couple of years. And I moved from there into a private outpatient neurofeedback clinic. So it was like really
cool,
opposite of what I was doing in inner city Philadelphia. And this was in the burbs. And I thought, oh, well, this seems interesting. And I trained to become a neurofeedback clinician. And, you know, I worked primarily with children and adolescents, although some adults would be involved as well. But mostly it was a clinic for children and adolescents and for people that had neurological challenges like attention deficit disorder, learning disabilities, what we used to call pervasive developmental disorder or delay, autism, people on the spectrum, on the autistic spectrum. And so I was, you know, in the process of that training, I learned so much about the brain. And I learned so much about how, you know, I started to piece together like, everything that I'm learning about the brain and all these different brain waves and how certain brain waves can be attuned when we're focused and less attuned when we're not. And, you know, theory that has been around for many decades, looking at, you know, different kinds of training protocols and neurofeedback and biofeedback, looking at how we have control of our physiological states to an extent, and looking at, you know, when we're able to control our nervous system activity, when we're able to use measurements, looking at body temperature, heart rate variability, skin conductance. I thought, man, this is so interesting. And how is it that we don't really tap too much into this in art therapy? Because at the time I thought, oh, I mean, this is back in 2001, so it was a while ago. And it's like, you know, it would be really interesting to see how we could track progress through neurofeedback using art products, you know, using drawings. And so I was able to do some research at that clinic, and I was like way in over my head because I was going at this alone. And I mean, no surprise there. I kind of have a tendency to get in over my head sometimes. I get really excited, you know, about the possibilities. Of everything. And, but I put together this really involved research project. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to do so. You know, the owners of the outpatient clinic were all for it. And basically what I did was I used the brief art therapy screening evaluation, which was developed by Dr. Nancy Gerber back at Hahnemann. And it's a very short assessment, 10 minutes tops, you know, and I did an assessment before and after participants' neurofeedback training, which usually lasted about 6 months. And so in that process, I was able to gather, I think it was 15 participants, and looked at artwork from their assessments in the beginning of treatment and at the end of treatment, and then compared that with their brainwave activity, compared that with their behavioral change that was gathered through self-assessment, parental and teacher measures. I mean, it was super powerful. It was really exciting. And that, you know, I never did anything with it. And this was back in the day, we were using like little floppy disks on computers.
Oh, yeah.
You know, all my data was on floppy disk. And I moved one time and I ended up throwing it all away, except for the artwork and the consents. Don't ever do that. If anybody's listening, like, don't ever throw away data, for heaven's sakes. But whatever, I did. And a couple years later, I was thinking, I should put this together for the art therapy conference. And, you know, this was back in 2011, I guess. And I did just that, or maybe it was a little earlier. I think it was around that time. Anyway, it was like, the culture, the world was starting to catch up a little bit. You know, Chris Belkafer and Lucas Konopka had completed an EEG study, you know, an independent case study looking at EEG brainwaves with art making. And I thought, yeah, let me get in on this because I have all this really great stuff. I just never really finished enough. And so I put together what I guess would be like a theoretical presentation of understanding how we can look at the brain, how we can look at brain waves, how we can look at artwork and kind of track some parallels, you know, start to make some connections across these different forms of expression. And right after that, I moved out to Indiana to develop and implement a graduate art therapy program at Herron School of Art and Design. And I really used my foundations of neuroscience and this just growing interest in how neuroscience really informs every single thing that we do. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer because, like, as humans, we can explain our behavior with science. And in particular to art therapy, the potentials to look at all the different ways that neuroscience evidence and principles informs our work are just very profound. And I built the philosophy and kind of the image and the brand, if you will, of that program on these neuroscience foundations with full awareness that we don't have enough evidence at this time to make correlations between what it is that we're observing in treatment and what it is that's happening inside the brain. We've gotten better, closer now. Yeah. But still, there's some significant gaps from research to practice. And all that being said, the Indianapolis community, you know, I worked on a campus that was connected to the medical school and the School of Social Work and Counseling and Physical Therapy and, you know, health rehabilitation and education. So they were very, very welcoming and open to this like growing art therapy program and its scientific perspectives and foundations. And so ever since then, you know, I've just engaged in different ways to study this and to share and to advocate for this. And here we are. And yeah, I could go on. Yeah.
No, it's your life's work. You've been investing in this over the course of your career. And I think that it's important to share those beginning stories for folks that are just coming up and stepping out, because it can feel really intimidating. We're told that we have to do research. We need more research. We need more research. But many of us find ourselves working in locations where if research is going to happen, it is only going to happen because that person buttresses that responsibility independently. Most of us aren't working in places where it's, you know, we have access to a team of people to help us do research. Or like, I think back to being an undergrad in psychology, where the psychology department had ongoing research all the time, but there was like a whole team. There's so much support around conducting all of that research. But in our field, we didn't get that. There was nothing like that in grad school. You might have been expected to do research as part of your thesis, but that again, that was your undertaking. You had to undertake the financial responsibility of conducting that research. It's a big ask for people, but if you're passionate about it, then it's doable, right? Like what you were saying, you were in a clinic, you're like, this was over my head, but I did it. But because you did it, it has like informed each step that you've taken thereafter. And I think that's really inspiring.
Yeah, thanks. And it's absolutely, it speaks to the importance of collaboration, and we can call it interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary collaboration. But when it comes to researching art therapy in the brain, I don't see a way of doing that without a collaborative team.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned how most of us art therapists, we're in clinical or community contexts where it's not like there's research funding and you're day to day. And honestly, it's very similar in some, well, let me say, art therapists also face a challenge in academic institutions with having the kind of position, typically research positions in academia are tenure track positions, and they have dedicated time to research, service, and education or teaching. And some schools and universities have a lot more resources to support that. Traditionally, art therapists have been, the master's degree is our terminal degree still. And traditionally, art therapy programs are not research-based programs. Art therapy is a master's degree. People go to school to get the training to become a clinician. There are a few doctoral programs that, have emerged over the last decade or so. Dr. Gerber, who I mentioned, started the PhD in creative arts therapies at Drexel. And there's a small handful. Leslie has a longstanding program, PhD. So there's several schools that offer higher level education to help art therapists who are interested in research, to promote that. And at the same time, I will say most of my work that I've done, most of the research that I've done has been on a volunteer basis, where I get to work with really generous, awesome people that are willing and interested in, we for example, we did an EEG study at IUPUI at IU, and myself and my graduate student at the time, Caitlin Knapp, Alex Shake, we worked with people in the Department of Neurology that volunteered their equipment and their time to, conduct the EEGs and to do the analysis. We had a statistician who volunteered her time to look at the data, and then an analysis for the actual brainwave activity. Everything was volunteer, and so certainly I've gotten support. I'm at GW now and here in Washington, DC, and certainly you apply for grants and hopefully you get them. And I will say that most of the work that I've done has been volunteerism, within the capacity of my academic role. And so I don't say that, I say that to just explain that a lot of times we have to go outside the box if we want to get stuff done and if we want to really see our visions and our dreams come true. We had a really great symposium. My research, I think I've been involved in program development a lot throughout my career as well. And I really love, developing programs for people in different contexts. And something that we were able to do out in Indiana, I guess this was back in 2017, was to run a symposium on neuroscience, arts, and related therapeutics. And we had, I think, 8 different schools at the university, 13 different speakers. We had 3 keynote speakers in creativity science and neuroaesthetics and in mobile brain body imaging. And we put this on, I pounded the pavement to raise some money so that we could feed people and have a reception. And we certainly got funding, through some of the grants that are offered through the university. And again, a lot of the time it was volunteerism and people that genuinely believe in this work and its potential. They're out there, and so I think that that's really important for us to consider.
No, I agree. I think that is an important factor. And I think that sometimes that can be a limitation too for folks that are like their clinical caseload is so full. They have a passion and they want to, but then there's the capacity, right, for the extra, because to do all of that research, it does take a lot. But I agree that it is well needed and important. And the only way that we can start to, I think, acquire more funds is through the initial evidence base that you're creating through the initial research, which might be, like you're saying, you're scrapping it, you're figuring out how to do it the best way that you can. And I really value how you're saying there's really a lot of importance in collaboration and bringing in other members of the community, whether that's within the art therapy community, but also outside of the art therapy community, to collaborate on these types of projects, so that we can build more robust scientific-based research, which in terms of mental health, I mean, that's the expectation, right? Evidence-based practice is really looking at where's the science, where does the data point to? Why is this useful? And I think that can help us to translate people that may be on the outskirts of like wanting to try art therapy. If they have that information, they're, more informed consumers of like, oh, there's actual science here that demonstrates how this is going to be beneficial for my loved one or my child or myself.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we need scientific evidence, right? Like, of course we do. And I'm glad that you brought up evidence-based practice, because something that we grapple with in arts and health, let's say arts and health outcomes research, or any kind of integration of science and arts research for therapeutic benefits, we need the experimental designs. We need to isolate those variables and test them. Traditionally, cognitive neuroscience, neuroaesthetics, this kind of research takes place in the lab. There's a neural variable, it's very controlled. Absolutely. And when we're dealing with people, when we're doing research in mental health and psychology and counseling, psychotherapy, we must have different forms of evidence to show efficacy for what it is that we do. And so there's questions here, like what actually is evidence? What constitutes evidence? Is evidence only that which is considered through the scientific method? Or is evidence also sense-based knowledge, aesthetic evidence and knowledge that we know from our observations and clinical practice strategies, what it is that we see happening take place in the context of doing our work. And so I think that's where the arts and an understanding of how to actually go about studying that in a way that allows for, well, we might say the phenomenological experience of the person, the client, the participant. We need to understand their perception just as much as we need to have a tight, controlled question and hypothesis testing, right? So this very much calls for mixed methods where we can use these quantitative methods and measures and also qualitative data that comes from participant voice, that comes from therapist voice, and that also comes from the art. And so there's so many different ways of going about doing our research, but hands down, we must build the evidence for what it is that we do, because evidence is needed in our society to support our work, to support our insurance companies and insurance billing and reimbursement, right? If you choose to go that route. There's a lot of arguments out there about why do we need evidence, or like, we know that what we're doing works. So why do you need it? I went to an awesome conference this past fall, and I was talking to some people from the UK that do like really important community-based interventions. Dawn was her name. She was so cool. And she was like, I don't get it. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, Juliet. I wish I could do her accent, but she's like, I get it. I mean, and you sound very smart. So that's wonderful. But like, I don't need this. She's like, I don't need this to know that what I'm doing works. And I'm like, absolutely, Dawn. Of course. And we have an obligation. We have an obligation as a profession to keep up with the times. We have an obligation, an ethical obligation, to use the most current data available to us to inform our work. Right? Like, it's a part of being a therapist.
So true. Right. And I think it's one thing for us to understand as practitioners. We're embodying this on a day-to-day basis. We're having a lived experience that is a culmination of observations and events, right? That builds our own inner knowledge. But as somebody who has no awareness, no knowledge base, outside looking in, they need that information to say that this is the right choice for me or my loved one to engage in this type of treatment modality versus something else over here.
Absolutely. And in building initiatives, like working with the Department of Defense, or working with Homeland Security, looking at school safety initiatives, right? Addressing trauma in the school system, like, there is so much opportunity for art therapists to become more embedded in these initiatives. And it's necessary. Right, for the health and well-being of society. And the government officials that are going through these proposals need to see evidence, right? Scientific evidence. And so, it's a challenge, and it can become a barrier to our work. But ultimately, I think that that's our reality. So we adapt and overcome.
Right. I think it's like nothing is black and white. Everything's on a continuum, and there's rationale for both. Like, I can appreciate and totally understand where the colleague that you were mentioning, Dawn, is coming from. I feel like I've been there at certain points in my career too. Like, I don't care. I just want to, focus in and do the work. But then there's the other piece of like, well, I have to care because this is like funding my job. I have to do the research to demonstrate the efficacy of the program that I'm in order to continue to get the grant funding to continue to do the work. I'm not in that role anymore because I have my own practice. But at one point in time, I was in a role like that where I was doing research on the program that I was operating because in order to continue to get funding for the program to exist, we needed that. So it exists both at the same time. But I would love to talk with you a little bit about what you believe are some of the most important things that as expressive arts therapists and creative arts therapists, what are the essentials that we really need to be knowledgeable about, learning about, as it pertains to neuroscience informed practices, and being able to, I think, educate and communicate about that with our clients to help them understand these benefits that I think go beyond psychological, right? They're neurobiological, they're physiological. Yeah.
So that's a big question.
I'm sorry.
No, that's a great question. It's a big question. The most important.
Well, things that you think are very these are very important that all of us really should kind of have a general knowledge base about to be able to translate that for our clients.
Yeah. So, well, I think that you actually said kind of what's at the crux for practicing clinicians. And that is, how do we understand what we're doing with our clients? And then how do we translate knowledge to our clients about that? Because, I'm willing to have a conversation with anybody about why we do need neuroscience in art therapy. I think it'd be real fun to have a debate one of these days, so maybe we could do that in the future. But the reality is that the more that people are informed about the way that their brains and their bodies operate, then the more normalizing their experiences, right? Mm-hmm. So the science actually helps to destigmatize one's experience. Mm-hmm. The science helps to universalize one's experience. The science helps to connect us with one another on a playing field, just like the arts. I see neuroscience being very similar to the arts, right? Of course, it's culturally specific and contextual. Of mm-hmm. course, we must consider individual preferences. We must consider environment, biopsychosocial, spiritual factors, of course, right? And the science and the arts allows us this kind of open ground where we can have discussion and discourse and rely on tenets of psychoeducation and neuroeducation, which is essentially translating knowledge about the brain, the nervous system, and the body to help our clients, knowing when to do that, knowing how to do that, knowing when not to do that. What is it that we know? What is it that we don't know? What is it that we don't know that we don't know, right? So all of these words to say, having a better understanding of brain and nervous system activity in general, having a better understanding of how creative process engages different brain networks and also different bodily systems. We don't always reach creativity in art therapy or creative arts therapies. It's often a goal. Sure. But the flow state, creativity, sublimation, if you will, is not always achieved, right? We have really good science that's showing the positive physical and mental health benefits when the flow state is achieved, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it's not always the case. I think for art therapists, knowledge about the trauma response in the brain, the nervous system, and the body, which you can get a nice handle on by reading van der Kolk, right? The body keeps the score. Yeah. I mean, at the very least. And it's interesting because, this kind of work is very much embedded now in art therapy education programs. From what I can see, it's not embedded in psychology programs. I have psychology comrades that never even read the book or heard of it, which is shocking to me. Right.
Wow.
So that's something. Yep. And the emergence and the support of polyvagal theory, Dan Siegel's window of tolerance, Pat Ogden's work, so many art therapists go in to get EMDR training. And there's a world of neurobiological information out there that is accessible and available to us. And some of it is more scientifically sound than others, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think what's really important is having a nice handle, because trauma is so prevalent and because it really does impact our verbal systems, our ability to communicate, our memory, right? Mm-hmm. And all point to the value of the expressive therapies in treatment. As Tally Tripp, the late Tally Tripp, said, trauma or art therapy is a treatment of choice for trauma, right? And so this is very important to our work, and having just a basic understanding of trauma processing on the cognitive, emotional, nervous system is integral to any therapeutic work. I think for art therapists in particular, catching up on that expressive therapies continuum. You know, Via Lucebrink did her first, Kagan and Lucebrink came out with the ETC theory in 1978. Talk about
it's wild, right?
Well,
yeah.
And they were doing like EEG studies. Like, what? Yeah. So, but interestingly, in my research, I found that not all graduate programs have an emphasis on the ETC. And listen, the ETC isn't the end all be all, man, but it is the most cogent framework that we have to understand material properties, material choice, how actual art materials influence our intervention strategies. And this theory is correlated, you know, loosely at this time, not tested yet, but correlated with brain function. And this is really integral to our work, because the more that we are able to understand how different art materials engage sensory, motor, visual systems, our sensory systems, then the more certain we can be, the more thoughtful we can be about what our interventions are based on whoever it is that we're working with. So I think specifically to art therapy, the ETC and understanding of materials, you know, Ingrid Penzes, Shireen Malik, obviously Lisa Hines, Lucebrink and Hines, you know, so many of these articles are open access and available to the public that you can capture by a simple Google Scholar search, right? And so I think specific to art therapy is really understanding some of these theories that help us connect art making and material choice with the science, obviously trauma processing. And if you're so inclined, I would definitely start poking away into learning about large scale brain networks, default mode network activity, because the research is like, you know, cascading out there about how creativity engages different networks in the brain. And these expressive processes are really important for us to understand and study. So.
Very cool. I appreciate you bringing the ETC into the conversation. It definitely, I think it doesn't get as much, is it like acknowledgement as it really deserves, and certainly way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And when it,
you know, I think too, I'm thinking about the ETC in the back of my mind, but, you know, what we are taught in graduate school, you know, in-depth psychological theory, clinical skills, human development, theories of creativity, theories of symbolism, you know, that are specific to art therapy. And we can understand as art therapists, like everything that we do creatively requires all of our senses, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we agree with it or not. That's science. So it's like the more we understand our tactile, our smell, our hearing, auditory, our sight, right? The more we understand how the arts are central to processing information and the ways that that information processing engages different emotional systems, reward and motivation, what makes us want to go to therapy and like absolutely stay away from it, what makes us get closer to the mandala, or like I'm never touching clay again, right? Understanding these nuances, you know, is super exciting, and it can be understood with scientific information that gives us, you know, insights into how our brains process this sensory information. We don't have this with just words, you know? So I think that's real relevant.
So true. So true. So where has your like most recent kind of studies and forays into neuroscience taken you, and what do you see on the like forefront in this area?
Yeah, well, I was just telling my colleague the other day that I think I'm like a soothsayer because, like, seriously, Raina, like 10 years ago, I was like, we got to get, maybe it was, yeah, it was 10 years ago. I was like, we got to get on the board with this neuroaesthetics thing, this cognitive neuroscience of aesthetic experiences. And my boss at the time, the chair of neurology out at IU, he was like, yeah, well, I know some of the key players that we can, you know, we can cultivate and build connections with. I said, oh, okay. And he's also said, but empirical aesthetics, like this is a whole different world. It's very complicated stuff. And I was like, okay, well, you know, and I wrote a little bit about this in the first edition of Art Therapy, Trauma, and Neuroscience, just like in the introduction, because I learned about this neuroscience of aesthetics, and so much of what it is that they study in the lab relates to what we do, right? Like
That's fascinating.
what they're talking about, interoceptive properties, engagement of the reward system, autonomic instability, default mode network activity, right? But traditionally neuroaesthetics has been in response to static 2D artwork. You know, neuroaesthetics just emerged as like a discipline, a sub-discipline of cognitive neuroscience back in 1999. So it's relatively new. But of course, its roots, like art therapy, go way back to the beginning of time, looking at philosophical arguments of what is aesthetics, where does knowledge come from, you know? So all that being said, I joke about being a soothsayer, but look, a decade later, we got the NeuroArts blueprint. We have the Hopkins Arts and Mind Lab, who has what they do is applied neuroaesthetics, right? This whole lab is based on, you know, the tenets of the biological responses to aesthetic experiences, how it is that they use the science, they might use the theory to inform different kinds of individual and community interventions across the board, right?
That's
so
really awesome.
It's awesome. It's a hot topic, right? It's on point. But I do have a question though, because I'm like, well, where are the art therapists in all the conversations about neuroaesthetics? You know, some scientists are more inclined to partner with creative arts therapies. And, you know, in the last decade or so, the understanding of neuroaesthetics has moved beyond 2D artwork. And it's more, you know, including temporal experiences of music and of dance and performance, right? So it's real, like the entire field has expanded.
Have you been to Meow Wolf?
No, I've heard of that though. What is that?
Okay. So like this entire conversation that we're having is making me think of that experience. So it is a completely immersive, artistic experience. It's three-dimensional. It's all created by a variety of different artists. It started out of a collection of people out in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they overtook some old bowling alley. And like you go into this world and it's interactive. There's music, there's touch, there's lighting, and it is, when you're talking about like the neuroaesthetic properties, I think it would be fascinating. I think those folks would have a fascinating time researching what happens to people in that environment, because it's not like any other artistic experience you'll ever have. There's like a narrative story. There's just and it's crazy. You can play like a xylophone, which is off some like dinosaur creature's rib cage, like just like weird. It's so weird,
cool stuff.
but it's fun and it's engaging. And like you were talking about, like how these types of experiences, an immersive experience, the entire sensory system is engaged here. Sight, smell, sound, touch, everything. What's happening to the neural reward circuitry, and like what's happening with our serotonin levels and our dopamine levels when we're engaging in things like this and we're in the moment, we're having this like pleasurable aesthetic experience.
Right. Like what is happening? And if we could answer that question, that like there are so many ways to answer that question. I believe that the science, the cognitive neuroscience of aesthetics gives us a lot of support to develop what the questions actually are and how do we go about answering what those questions are, right? I see very much a pairing and a collaboration between the cognitive neuroscience, neuroaesthetics, and the creative arts therapies. How do we take, how do we bridge that information, the data that we get from the lab, and how do we bridge that to the people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how, and so we're looking at bridges all over the place here, because as our conversation started, so many art therapists are clinicians, they're working in communities and clinics, the researchers are over here in the academic institutions. How do we connect us? Right? Same kinds of things, because our work needs to have what we call an ecological validity. We're interested in real world practice, which is the focus of like the Arts and Mind Lab, right? Like they're interested in real world applied neuroaesthetics. And so I think that, and again, I'll mention the NeuroArts Blueprint again, because they are very much spearheading this initiative, global initiative, to understand more about how neuroscience intersects with arts to inform so many different ways of supporting and helping people. What I am pushing for in my bold advocacy forever is like, put some art therapists, a movement therapist, a music therapist, get the therapists as part of the research protocol, as part of the research design, because we are the ones that know what's going on in the clinical context. We can help develop what those questions are that need to be asked. One of my mentors one time, he's a cognitive neuroscientist, Norberto Grivitz, and he's been part of the arts and brain circuit for a really long time. So helpful. Years ago, he said to me, well, you're interested in this research, but what do you actually think? Like, you're the clinician, so you would know after all these years, like, what do you see change? What's most interesting to you in art therapy from a neuroscience point of view? He said, if it were me, I would think about how basically he was describing the flow state. He's like, I think it's really amazing how you can kind of go somewhere else while you're actually in the process of doing the work. And I was like, yeah, that's interesting. I'm really into symbolic communication, though. I'm really interested in how that symbol is used in so many different forms, with so many different people and contexts as a way to communicate. Right. And there's so many ways to do that. Like, it never fails. I've never seen the symbol not be a way to express an element, understanding, insight, and so that has always been kind of like rattling my cages a bit, is like, how do we understand? But this is really complicated stuff. Talking to the cognitive neuroscientists about all these ideas, some of them, are awesome. And they'll say, yeah, okay, Juliet, this is a great place to start. Now we got to like funnel in here and figure out like, what are you, because your question involves 75,000 questions,
Right.
And then other people are like, who's this person? Like, bye. Like, we ain't got the time for you. She's just an art therapist. I'm like, but we deal with this everywhere, right?
Yeah.
people have their biases, their beliefs. You know, some people are wearing thicker blinders than others. And I just say, come on, man, we have to transcend. We have to get over ourselves and our silos and our egos. And we need to work together to figure out the best ways to provide evidence for what it is that we do. And to me, neuroaesthetics is a no-brainer because they literally study the brain and aesthetic experiences. So fortunately, these advocacy groups and labs are doing great work to advance the inquiry.
No, that is wonderful. I certainly, I recently learned about something called social prescribing, where, right, like that whole movement where medical communities are prescribing folks to go engage in arts practices, going to a museum, having some kind of cultural experience. And I think that is in a large part because of the research that's coming out that's showing the psychosocial and physical benefits of us engaging in the arts, which isn't shocking, right? Because you were talking about it earlier, like this is part of human history. This is part of humanity, who we are. You know, we're not, necessarily meant to like be sitting in front of the TV, watching TV all day. You know, we're meant to be engaging and having meaning and making experiences throughout our lives. So it makes sense that would be happening. It just seems like it's taken a long time to get there. But
yes, I do.
Yeah. So I know that
time, though. I mean, we're moving at warp speed with new knowledge. Now is the time. And to have these large groups that are advocating, the World Health Organization, the Jameel Arts and Health Lab up in New York, the Center for Arts and Medicine down in Florida, Jill Sankey, she's a key player in pioneering the social prescription movement that hasn't made its way to the States, but in Canada, in the UK, doctors are prescribing social arts experiences as part of rehabilitation and treatment, which makes all the sense in the world to us.
Right. But it's awesome to see that it's happening and growing. And so hopefully that will continue as more research is, put in the pipeline and people can really see like there's a lot of benefit here. It's not just, fun or recreation, and like fun and recreation actually can be very beneficial and therapeutic and healthy for us too. Exactly. Right. It doesn't have to be separate. But that's how we like to, codify things in our adult world. Right. Well, I know I have already kept you for an hour, and
has it been that long?
Yes, been about an hour, but it's been wonderful.
So fun to talk to you.
And fun to talk to you too. And I feel like I learned so much. I want to, leave a little bit of a teaser. I want to have you come back. I know, would you be willing to share just like a little teaser of what you're working on? And have you come back once it's ready for consumers?
Yes. And I think and I'm fine to say that my dissertation research was the development of a neuroscience-informed art therapy toolkit for the treatment of trauma. So it's an interactive web design, and it's a toolkit that is geared towards the practitioner, and then also with modifications can be geared towards the client as well. So I'm working through some of the publishing outlets right now and dealing with trademark and copyright, but it was a really interesting, intense, long study. And I won't, I'll just say this is a toolkit that was informed by the participants, which are practicing art therapists, and it also includes feasibility testing. And so my advisors kind of beat it out of me a bit. This is not Juliet King's toolkit. This is a toolkit for therapists based on what therapists want and need. And that's part of research, right? That's why it's research. And so it was a pretty involved study. And I'm really excited for it because there are some very specific modifications that I can make to make the toolkit available to different stakeholder groups. And we're going to start with art therapists and clients. So
that's really exciting. I can't wait to see the final product and test it out.
Thank you. I'm excited. So yeah, I'll let you know and we can chat about it, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely. So for folks that are listening that want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, or maybe they're inspired and they have questions about how to get involved in research, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, either at tertiary process, TERTIARYPROCESS @gmail.com, or my GW or my IU email. It's KINGJUL @gwu.edu. Yeah. So one of the outcomes of my research was the need for a collaborative hub where art therapists can join. And my colleague, Carrie Kruk, who's an art therapist, and Ingrid Penzes, who I mentioned, they are initiating an international art therapy research consortium, or International Art Therapy and Neuroscience Research Consortium. And I believe some of the mission of that is to form a collaborative hub and a network. And so stay tuned for that too. Hopefully the next time we talk, I'll have more information about that.
That's awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been so fun talking with you today, and I'm grateful for you making the time to share with us and encourage other folks in the community to understand more about art and the brain.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, listeners, thanks for joining us, and check us out next week. We're going to be having Dawn Barrow on the show, and she's also going to talk a little bit about neuroscience in terms of understanding assessments and how to understand assessments and interpret those into interventions. But she's also going to be talking about pivoting out of being a therapist as her primary role and making some shifts, which I'm excited to hear about what she's doing and how she's going about that too. Awesome. So stay tuned for that. But for now, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.